This week, I had the privilege of sitting down with none other than Roger Altman, one of the most influential Americans in modern finance. Roger began on Wall Street as the youngest ever general partner of Lehman Brothers, helping to shape the firm during a pivotal era in American finance. He then went on to become Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Jimmy Carter's presidency. He later worked alongside Pete Peterson and Stephen Schwarzman to build Blackstone in its earliest days before returning to public service as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury under President Clinton, where he played a central role in shaping economic policy during a time of major fiscal transition. In 1995, Roger founded Evercore with a vision of independent, high integrity advice. Today, the firm stands along the most respected names in global finance, with over 2,000 employees, a $10 billion market cap, and more than $5 trillion in transactions advised. In this episode, which is one of Roger's most comprehensive in years, we spoke about his early life, lessons from Lehman and Blackstone, navigating public service, the founding of Evercore, and the philosophies that have guided him through 5 decades of change. I really enjoy this episode, and I hope you guys do too. If you're not already following the Spotify channel or subscribe to the YouTube channel, I'd urge you to do so. If you enjoy this podcast, please rate it a 5 out of 5 stars on Spotify. And share this to any friends, family, anyone who you think would find this interesting. I'm really trying to get the podcast out there. I think there's a lot of value in here that many people could find very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Roger, for joining me. I really appreciate it. It's safe to say you've had one of the more prolific careers of the people I've interviewed. So thank you for taking the time, and I appreciate it.
That may say more about the people you've interviewed than me, but go ahead.
I'd love to start off in the beginning where I always start. You grew up in Brookline. You were born in Brookline and you grew up in Boston. Can you tell me a little bit about your childhood, kind of what your interests were, and how you eventually found your interest in politics?
Oh, by the way, I was born and grew up in Brookline.
Okay.
So I grew up in a rather classic Boston liberal family. I'm using the term Boston broadly. My mother was an ardent progressive, maybe not by today's standards, but by certainly standards of those years. And ultimately, I was in a single family household because my father died when I was quite young. I was 10 years old. And my mother was a municipal librarian, worked for the city of Boston Public Library System for 33 years. And she was deeply literate and passionate about current affairs of all kinds. And I think that's what fundamentally gave rise to my interest in government, which one way or another I acquired at a very early age. So that's how I would describe where I think it came from.
So you eventually went to Georgetown and then Chicago, where you happened to room with Howard Marks. And I'm going to mention him a bit later. I have an interesting question surrounding that. But during your time, both at Georgetown and University of Chicago, were there any formative experiences that shaped your views on kind of what you wanted to do, or just kind of shaped you as a person or as a character?
Well, I was very involved in student government at Georgetown. I was elected vice president of my class in my junior and senior year. I ran for president of the student body and narrowly lost. There's an amusing anecdote about that because I lost by 17 votes out of, I don't know, 1,500 cast or something. The year after I ran for that post, Bill Clinton ran for the same post. He was the year behind me. We knew each other in the sense that one person from who's a junior might know a sophomore. I mean, not intimately, and I helped his campaign. He helped my campaign my year, and I helped his campaign his year. And many, many, many years later, it's now 1993, I'm serving in the Clinton administration as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. And in the course of the campaign that Clinton ran the year before, I had frequently introduced him, particularly at fundraisers. And my recollection was that he won the presidency of the Georgetown student body quite easily. So I often introduced him that way, saying I saw firsthand what a giant talent he was at such a young age. I must have done that 10 times. And he always smiled broadly. And then in the 1993, the first serious biography of Clinton comes out. It was called First in His Class by David Moranis, a very good writer. And I promptly got a hold of the book and was sitting late one night reading it. And I come across the description of his senior year at Georgetown and that he lost resoundingly for that job. And I was so dumbfounded by that I consulted a couple of classmates whom I'd stayed in touch with because I thought the Moranis was wrong. Well, it turned out I was wrong. So 6 or 8 or 10 times, whatever the number was, I'd introduced Clinton enthusiastically as having shown his amazing political talent when he was 17 years old by winning the presidency of the student body by a landslide, when in fact he'd lost. And I've joked about this with President Clinton, but he never chose to correct me. But anyway, I was very involved in the student government, and you know, I learned quite a bit about the idea of government, and I learned quite a bit about running in that election, which persuaded me never to do it again. But that was the most interesting part of my college years. Actually, my college years had nothing to do with my later choice of career in terms of private sector.
Yeah.
But that was the most interesting. And it was an advantage, a big advantage, to go to college in Washington, which is one of the big reasons I decided to go to Georgetown, because there you are in the seat of government. And, if you wanted to, and I did this a few times, you just walk into a hearing up on the Hill. I mean, it was like government right in front of you, And there was a very famous professor of government at Georgetown named Professor Quigley, Carroll Quigley, Bill Clinton's favorite professor, but he really was good. And if you took his course, which I did, and then a few times, I don't mean to say I did it all the time, but you wandered around the Hill, it was really quite a great juxtaposition of what you might call the theory and the practice. It was a really good place to go to school if you were interested in government.
So you come out of Chicago, and if I'm correct, you spent some time on some campaigns and a little bit of the world of politics, but you end up on Wall Street, and you yourself state that you didn't know the difference between equity and debt when you ended up on Wall Street. But before I kind of get deeper into your time on Wall Street, your time in the private sector, I'd love for you to give me a brief overview of from your time at Chicago all the way to founding Evercore, just kind of like a brief timeline of your career and the positions you had and how you ended up in those positions.
Well, first of all, my going to Wall Street was a bit of an accident. And I would actually say a lot of my career has been a bit of an accident. And I don't mean that humorously. I think fate plays a bigger role than any degree of planning. At least that's been my experience. I really woke up one day my senior year of college and decided that my longstanding plan to go to law school didn't really interest me. It was really more my mother's plan than it was mine. So I decided I'm not doing that. And I looked around and said, well, I guess I'll go to business school. And Chicago, unfortunately, was a great place if you thought corporate finance was a giant math course, because corporate finance in Chicago is essentially math. And I didn't like that approach to it. I struggled through it too. It was hard. But it didn't prepare you at all to make a decision where you wanted to work. So I was flailing around in terms of, I thought I wanted to work in finance, and the only courses I enjoyed in Chicago were 1 or 2 finance courses, and barely enjoyed those. And but I decided to work in finance, and I really didn't know anything about it. I really didn't know anything about it, and I managed to get an interview at Lehman Brothers, which was an accident in the sense that they didn't come to the campus. So you had to effectively write a letter. Those are the years in which most employers of the type, the Goldman Sachs's and Morgan Stanley's and so forth didn't really go to campuses. So anyway, I got an interview, and didn't know anything about what it would be like to work there. Went to the interview. There were 2 of us that day being interviewed from Chicago. Howard was the other one. It's factually correct that they had decided beforehand to offer a job to Howard and not to me. But the third guy I interviewed, who was the real decision maker, confused us and thought I was Howard and offered me the job, which I promptly accepted on the spot. And then he was either too embarrassed or whatever to decide to reverse his decision, and I started work there. I started working immediately after grad. I didn't even stay for my commencement. I needed a job. I was broke, and I literally got a ride from Chicago to New York, and I started work like a week later. Now, there's a long story about the years at Lehman. I mean, it's just that we don't have enough time to talk about it. But
Of course.
essentially, when I started there, which was the middle of 1969, Wall Street was still, or investment banking, in its old guard phase. And at Lehman, there really wasn't a systematic approach to business. It was a bunch of very talented individuals who didn't like each other much and didn't work with each other at all, but were very good at what they did individually. Very small firms. I mean, Lehman had a payroll of about 200 people and no capital. Goldman Sachs was half a block down the street, same thing. These were tiny businesses. And then, about 3 or 4 years later, and in Lehman's case, it was a bit of a coup d'état. It was tumultuous. The old guard was essentially thrown out, and a new guard came in, and the firm began to enter into the modern era. And there was such a purge of the old guard and a lot of nepotism that it had given rise to, and it was a huge purge. And they ended up with very few young people. I mean, they kind of cleaned the place out. And one year, there were literally 12 human beings in the firm who worked in investment banking who weren't partners. So it wasn't all that hard to become a partner. And because about half of those people did, and I did early on, quite early, mostly because there were so few people, they had to have somebody. And while those first few years were brutally difficult, I mean, they were just tough because the place was disorganized. There was no training program. And if you weren't to the manner born, a lot of the people that I initially joined with when the old guard was, they're people whose parents had been at Wall Street and the whole social thing and the clubby thing and all that. If you weren't in that group, which I certainly wasn't, it was really hard to figure out which end was up. So that was a real struggle the first 3 or 4 years. But ultimately, I guess it's a little bit like Navy SEAL training. If you get through it, it's great for you. And I got through it, and it turned out to be great training, even though I wouldn't wish it on anybody. So I ended up being fairly good at it. But before I really had made any money or gotten anywhere, the opportunity to go to Washington arose, again, by accident somewhat. And I took it because that was my real passion. And I went down and served 4 years in the Carter administration. And the same sort of syndrome repeated itself because when I got there, I didn't know a thing. I mean, it would be difficult to overstate how little I knew. And the first couple of years, wow, I was a disaster, and came really close to being asked to leave, very close. But I got lucky. And the New York City fiscal crisis happened in my office. I was assistant secretary for domestic finance, which is a big bureau. And all kinds of credit programs or financing programs and so forth were the responsibility of that office. So the New York City fiscal crisis and what's the federal government going to do about it was the responsibility of my office. And just to make a very long story short, it worked out well. President Carter was very happy. Secretary Blumenthal was very happy. And I kind of dodged a bullet. And the same thing repeated itself, like almost the day after the New York City thing was resolved, the CEO of Chrysler shows up and says, we're going bankrupt. And out of the blue shows up. And to the Secretary of the Treasury, and I was in the meeting. And then we started another year of doing a loan guarantee act for Chrysler right after the New York City Loan Guarantee Act. And that was another amazing, incredibly intense thing. And so I ended up, my first 2 years were a disaster. My second 2 years were pretty good. President Carter, of course, didn't have that experience. He was having a tough time. And of course, Reagan won whatever it was, 48 states. And I was on my way back to New York. I went back to Lehman, which had changed a lot in those interim years. And within a year, I was co-head of investment banking. But then the firm, they had a coup. Lehman seemed to be fertile ground for coups, and the chairman of the firm, by far the best known partner, Pete Peterson, was ousted in a midnight raid. No one else knew it was coming. And the eventual fallout from that was just very, very harsh. I mean, eventually people decided they really resented that. And there was a tremendous division that was created in the firm. And the result of that was a decision to sell the firm, which happened in 1984. Really shouldn't have happened, but uh, it was the only compromise people could agree on at the time. And the firm was sold. And I, like everybody else, had to sign a 3-year non-compete. You could do anything you wanted in terms of teaching or art or take a course or go to the beach, but you couldn't compete. And I took one of those 3 years and taught at Yale. But then once it expired, I went to Blackstone the very first day, the very day it expired. There were only 5 people there. There were 4 people there when I got there. I was the 5th employee. And I stayed there for 5.5 years. Very, very, very educational, because I saw how just an idea, Blackstone, turned into, I mean, when I left, it wasn't the colossus anywhere near that it is today, but it was on its way. And I saw how that happened. And it was, it wasn't, they didn't ever, not every decision was a great decision. There were a lot of mistakes, but they made the right decisions generally. And by the way, I was not a founder of Blackstone. I got there about a year after it started, and that was a big difference. Steve Schwarzman often reminds me that difference between that and what I did was only about $35 billion. But in any event, but it was very, very educational and very related to founding Evercore years later. So I went back to Washington, served as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury for 2 years, very tumultuous period, came out and founded Evercore. And the experience I had at Blackstone, seeing how it was done, taking this tiny little firm with 5 people and building it up, gave me the confidence, or at least a willingness to try to set up Evercore. I mean, it taught me that it's not impossible. It's not the equivalent of climbing Everest without oxygen. You can do it. Without that experience, I never would have done it, I'm sure. And honestly speaking, Evercore was, I mean, the first few years are quite a struggle. You're trying to recruit people, find a client or two, pick some office space. You're a one-arm paper hanger in the first 3 or 4 years. That's very hard, very hard. But after that, the firm began to be pretty successful. And I mean, slowly, it wasn't an overnight thing. And, 30 and a half years later, which is where we are today, Evercore is the 3rd largest investment banking firm in the world. And it's on a tremendous roll right now. It's got a tremendous amount of momentum. And there you have it in a nutshell.
All of it is very fascinating, and you've done it, and you've done a lot with your career. But what I'd love to do is I'd love to touch on a couple experiences, specifically at Blackstone, a little bit at the Treasury, and then also founding Evercore, and kind of get a little bit deeper into those with the time we have. But my first question is about Blackstone. You were there in the early days. Like you said, it taught you a lot about how to build Evercore, but you also experienced the leadership of Pete Peterson and Steve Schwarzman, who Blackstone is a behemoth today, over $1 trillion in assets under management and stuff like that. But what was kind of their leadership styles like? And do you think at any point it rubbed off on you and kind of taught you how to lead? What leadership lessons did you learn from them? And did they rub off on you?
Well, they had a very successful partnership because Pete was Mr. Outside and Steve was Mr. Inside. And Steve was and is a absolutely brilliant deal maker. I mean, he is. And it was a terrific partnership in terms of complementarity. And it was Steve who had the vision of some version of Blackstone today. And I have to give Steve tremendous credit because he's just created this incredible firm. I mean, it's just breathtaking. And he also chose really well, this is long after I left now, some of the people to help him do it. Tony James, who was longstanding president, now John Gray. He really chose well in terms of the people around him. Pete left the firm at the time they went public. But they had a very successful partnership. And did some amazing things. I mean, the 3 of us raised an $835 million fund in '88 when none of us had ever invested a nickel. And it was really a tribute to the salesmanship, the Peterson skills that Peterson had, which were otherworldly, and Steve's real brilliance in terms of conceiving deals. But I have to say, my own approach from a leadership point of view is quite different.
Okay.
Uh, I'm a big believer in that the most important thing in a business by 100 miles is culture. And that famous observation by Peter Drucker that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And the single biggest reason Evercore has been successful has been that we have a very different culture here than other firms in this industry. Very, very different. And we've stuck with it and we've been fanatical about it. And the reason it's been the key is because people really like working here. We have no turnover. The idea that a firm like this, which is now $3.5 billion of revenue, give or take, has no senior turnover, and we really haven't had any. If you define turnover as somebody you'd like to keep who goes to work for a competitor, I mean, people leave to change careers, people leave to move to New Zealand, whatever it may be. But if you define turnover that way, we don't have any turnover. This is an industry which is infamous for high turnover rates, and the reason we don't have turnover is because of our culture. It's just very different. I could go off and give a long speech about that, but we don't have the time. Anyway, that's in the early years of Blackstone. I don't think as successful as they were and as brilliant as they were, I don't think anybody would have made that observation about Blackstone. That just wasn't their belief in the early years. Nothing adverse about it, just wasn't their priority. But that was what I think is the single most important reason Evercore has been successful.
And I guess one can say that scale and building up is somewhat of an enemy of culture. Once you get bigger and bigger, and that kind of entrepreneurial
well,
spirit.
theoretically, but not necessarily. We get that question every 5 minutes around here, and it's a fair question, which is, now that the firm's so much bigger, isn't it hard to have the same culture? And the answer is no. It is not that hard. Now, look, we have 2,500 people. We don't have, JP Morgan has 250,000. Goldman Sachs has 35,000. We have 2,500. So we're not really a giant organization in terms of people. It's larger by far than it ever used to be, but it's not that big. So maybe if we had 10 times the people, sure. But all you have to do is be, Andy Grove wrote that book, Only the Paranoid Survive. Well, if you're paranoid about it, or fanatical is my term, you can keep it going. You just have to really enforce it. We have a rule around here we call the no jerks rule. We don't hire somebody as a senior managing director, which is our term for partner, if any one of several of us thinks the person is going to be corrosive internally. We just don't hire them, no matter how productive or celebrated the person may be. And that's hard and fast rule around here. And anybody among 3 or 4 people, anybody who feels that way about a possible candidate can veto it. So no, we haven't nowhere near reached the size where you can't maintain the culture, not even close. And I've seen some very large organizations, much bigger than Evercore, that have great cultures. So I don't accept that argument.
Yeah. I want to take a step back really quickly and talk and kind of touch on your time in the Treasury, because I'm particularly interested in that. But you spent time in the Treasury, both as assistant secretary and deputy secretary. But if you were to mention one of the most challenging economic policy decisions you made, if you had to mention only one, and kind of how that shaped your perspective on the intersection of both politics and economics, what would it be? And how did it shape your perspective on the intersection of both politics and economics?
Well, that's a little bit of a imperfect question, because people ask me a lot about the difference between serving in government and serving and this industry here.
Yeah.
And they're night and day different. And one way they're different is, so if you're serving in the Treasury, you're part of what you might call a 5-sided equation. You have to deal with the Congress. You have to deal with the White House and the rest of the administration. You have to deal with the press. You have to deal with interest groups. And And you may, depending on the issue, have to deal with state and local governments. And at any given moment, any one of those may hold the whip hand. So you, even as Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, you are not going to single-handedly produce anything. Investment banking, you can sometimes single-handedly produce things, not the government. So the decision I made, that's not the way it works. It just doesn't work that way. So maybe one of our biggest accomplishments, which was a high wire act, if there ever was one, was the 1993 Clinton economic plan. It passed the House on a tie-breaking vote. It passed the House by one vote. It passed the Senate on a tie-breaking vote cast by Vice President Gore. And that was one of Clinton's really signature achievements. And it took a year to do, or almost a year. But there were hundreds and hundreds of people involved in that in the administration, let alone the other people I just mentioned, the Congress, the press, you name it. So no one person, possibly excepting the president, makes it happen. So there isn't really a good answer to your question that way.
Yeah. I like the answer you gave about accomplishments. That's kind of what I meant. What would you say as if you had to pick one thing you worked on that you thought was the most valuable, would it be? And I enjoyed to hear you speaking about it. But before we take a pause, I have a couple more questions I want to ask. But first of all, I'm fascinated by change. You've been in the lens of private equity, government, banking over the past 5 decades on Wall Street, or as long as you've been around on Wall Street. What's changed the most and what stayed the same? If you had to give it in a couple of sentences or a couple of words, in simple terms.
Well, one of the beautiful things about finance is that it's constantly reinventing itself. So there was a very large transaction announced yesterday that I worked on. I don't want to get into this.
Is it Warner Brothers Discovery?
I don't want to get into the details, but
okay.
It's enormously complicated. And some of the technology, if I can call it that, the finance technology that applies in that case to the capital market side of the transaction, just you wouldn't have even heard the language 5 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. Finance is constantly reinventing itself. So, for example, the rise of private credit. We're getting to a point where private credit may become more important than the traditional public credit markets and traditional bank lending. Okay, that's all in the last few years. So finance is just constantly reinventing itself. I mean, we have a great big business here doing continuation funds. Nobody heard of a continuation fund 5 years ago. That's finance right there. And so it's one of the beautiful things about it. It's one of the reasons that it's constantly challenging and keeps you alert. There's no standing still in finance, but it's a continuum, meaning it's been reinventing itself ever since I got into it. The rate at which it reinvents itself now is faster because of so much technology and globalization and everything else. But it's just a field that reinvents itself almost over every day. And that's a great thing about it, if you ask me. People always say, well, aren't you bored after all these years? No, because every day is different and every deal is different. And the technology today is so different than 5 years ago or 2 years ago. So it's a terrifically stimulating field that way. I mean, if you really like finance or the intersection of finance and client work, maybe, because I don't mean somebody sitting in a lab, it's never going to be boring because of how different it is. You know, that famous line, which is really quite important, that Heraclitus is said to have said, you can never step into the same river twice. And you know what he means by that if you imagine it. That's finance. You know, the water has passed by. It's not the same water. So that's one of the reasons I really like it. And that's one of the things I think that defines it.
Over the people I've interviewed in this podcast, I've generally noticed that with each person I interview, they have a certain skill at a point in time, which makes them special, which makes them stand out. For Steve Cohen, he was incredible. He was incredible person probabilistically. He played poker growing up. For Glenn Dubin, for Tully Friedman, the partner of the late Warren Hellman, who I knew was somewhat of a mentor to you. He was my last episode. He's an incredibly people-oriented person. He just has a gut feeling for people. But my question to you is, could you pinpoint a certain skill that kind of made you stand out from the rest of the pack, or is it just, are you generally a well-rounded person, you would say? Has there been a certain skill that set you apart?
Well, you're referring to finance? Because if you said to me, well, what does it take to be effective in government? I'd give you one set of answers. If you said, what does it take to be effective in finance? I'd give you a totally different set of answers.
Let's just focus on finance for now.
I'd say it's a combination of two related things. I was never any good at math, as my anecdote about the University of Chicago Business School illustrated, and I could not even remotely do what everybody around here calls the numbers. But when people bring into me one of these 80-page decks, which I see every day or every other day, it's going to be presented to a client, and 60 pages of numbers, I have the ability typically to understand what they mean, and pretty quickly, even though I couldn't do them. And it's a combination of that together with good communication skills. There are a lot of people in this industry who are brilliant, but not too good at communicating. There aren't that many people who have an aptitude for finance, and that's I think I have an aptitude for it, even though I couldn't do the numbers, and can communicate pretty well. That's an important combination. I don't think I'm like anywhere unique, at remotely unique. I could name many people in this business who I see having that same ability or better. But I mean, that's what I would say explains why I've done reasonably well.
One question before you go that I ask every single one of my guests. It's kind of it's a hallmark of my podcast. But if you had to give one piece of advice to a 15-year-old today, what would it be? Whether it be life, investment advice, I mean, not investment advice, but life advice on building a business, anything like that, what would it be?
Well, I don't know about to a 15-year-old, but when younger people show up to work here, and we hire analysts who are college graduates, and we hire associates who are grad school graduates, I'm often asked that question from them. They're a little older than you're talking about. And I have the same answer each time, which is, do not overplan your career. Do not think that you can sit here or sit wherever you're sitting and treat your career like an erector set. Like, I'm going to spend 2.4 years doing this, and I'm going to spend 4.1 years doing that, and I'm going to investment banking, then private equity, then I'm going to go to the corporate world. It never works like that. The roll of fate will be larger than any planning you make if you're talking about a few years out or beyond. So don't persuade yourself that you've got a 12-chapter plan for your career, because it won't happen. And don't obsess about it. Focus on the relatively short term and doing your best. But don't try to see everything as a means to another end. I run into too many younger people that do that. And they overplan their careers, and they waste a lot of time, and they delude themselves, because life does not work like that. So that would be my advice. And maybe not applying to 15-year-olds, but applies to a lot of 22-year-olds or 24-year-olds or 26-year-olds.
Especially in this day and age where everything has become, especially recruiting for things like investment banking, have become much more competitive. Everyone from a young age has these things planned out. But
I'll give you a small example. We can close on this. I have 3 adult children. Fortunately, they're doing well. I can remember obsessing about what's private schools they would go to in New York City. My wife and I obsessed about it. Well, and in retrospect, didn't make any difference at all. And that was just dumb. There were a lot of schools, and any one of 20 schools would have been fine. It was fine. But at the time, oh my goodness, so important. This one, not that one. Well, it was just misguided. misguided priority. That's a version of what I'm talking about. There are a lot of things you're going to do in life that you think are going to be the most important thing that ever happened to you, and they're not. And they're not going to turn out that way, and they never would have, because that's just not the reality. And life is in my experience a series of accidents or the interventions of fate. And if somebody asked me, if I could do it all over again, would I do it the same way? My answer would be no. No, I wouldn't. I'm not unhappy with the way it turned out, but I wouldn't. But that's what life had in store for me, and I'm grateful for it. But it's not what I would have planned, and it isn't what I did plan. So on that note, hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Roger. I really appreciate it. I found this conversation enjoyable. I think you did. I hope you did too.
Yeah, sure. It's fun.
And yeah, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it, and have a great summer.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.